Cool. Back there. Gonna start in about a minute. So just hang around until then. Okay. So as I mentioned last week, we're going to be doing an example. That's today. And please save any questions for the end of the session. And when you do so, feel free to unmute yourself after I finish giving the example. But obviously, if you can't stay until the end, please put it in the library chat. Yeah. And so if we start back, it might help if you've got the slides open because I'm going to be referring to them continuously throughout this session. So if we start from the character creation, just quickly, I want to say that I am a planner, as you can see here, and that means that I'll be focusing on the plot. I'll have to focus on the plot to avoid over planning. So I created this thing called the character creation menu with a few questions to get you to ask. Pardon? Okay. Yeah, just make sure you stay muted. And so if we look at the first character question, how can readers relate to the character? I'm going to be going through and creating a character. So in this example, the character will be able to be related to because they want something that the character also wants, and they also see the characters as real because they react emotionally. And so you've got to think, what does the character want that most people reading would also want? So if you look at main examples of what people want in modern society, you've got things like love and attention, or money, which has come up more recently after the Industrial Revolution, and even before then. So if we put in here, the thing that this character wants is they want to be seen. Because they've been marginalized by the society they live in, and so therefore they want attention. The emotional reaction, how can you get the readers to react emotionally? And I've chosen this because a lot of readers will be able to react emotionally to the concept of marginalization because it's something that has happened more frequently in recent history. So I'll just put marginalization there. Now, the next question I've got, also, it doesn't matter what the characters are named initially or what they look like. You could have a good idea, a good concept of this, but I'm not going to do it initially because the character name could be influenced by certain traits. that the character has, and this helps to create those kind of traits. So next, we've got what I call the character sliders, and so we've got likability, competence, and proactivity. And I'm going to do each of these from 0 to 10. So this character is relatively likable, so we'll place them in at 8 because they have good core values and they uphold them. Their competence is, however, quite low because they have been marginalized by society, and this prevented them from learning certain things, and therefore they have less competence. But the proactivity to do the things that they know is once again relatively high. And so you've got to change these over the course of your story, and so we'll have this down again here in the plot. The next question I had was the character arcs. And there are 2 different character arcs that I focus on: accomplishment and self-change. So the self-change is going to be the main one. So that's about a 7. And the accomplishment will balance that out. So let's just say a 3, because this person, they change themselves rather than having an impact on others. It's a story that follows the character. It's not a story that follows the character's feats. Now, if we move on to the next question, handicaps and flaws. And as I talked about last week, handicaps are things that are out of the character's control, and flaws are the things that are in the character's control. So, a handicap for this character would be that, let's say, this character is blind, and this was something the character was born with, and this is why they have been marginalized. And a flaw, so I'll just put H next to that so you know it's a handicap. And a flaw that this character has is this character gets very, very angry and is angry over small things and is constantly trying to prove that they're right. And that's a flaw. Obviously, if I had more time, I'd cover more handicaps and more flaws because this can help create the story. But currently, I've got here what I need to create an initial story. Next, we look at the question 5 and how would this character describe things? Describe. And we're going to use the proms framework. So PROMS. So P is for past. So this would be relating to times that they have been marginalized. So and events that they have been in. So, for example, let's say this character was present at the dawn of a century. So they were present dawn of the century. And let's say that I'm writing for fantasy. Being present at the dawn of the century could be a massive cultural thing, and therefore it's very important. And if we look at relationships, he or she, this character has been in a steady relationship but it recently broke off. Was previously. In a steady relationship. But this broke off because of some reason that the other person in this relationship before they broke up. And now we look at the obligations to society. So this character has obligations to family and upholding their family traditions. They have obligations to their friends. These are very, very common. They'll be in pretty much every story. And then obligation, finally, to the society or the race, because it depends. And now we move on to motivations. This character is motivated by what? You need to think about that. It's a very... I'd suggest you write that down, because this can help embellish your story, or perhaps even form the main the main plot. So if we look at the motivations of this character is motivated by the anger they feel towards those who have marginalized, and the sensibilities. So the things that are very, very obvious, and you couldn't. So for example, this character wouldn't kill because this goes against, let's just say, the traditions of the society. Wouldn't kill, but could hurt in anger. And so that's pretty much wrapping up the character. Now that we've done all of this, we can decide on a name, unless the setting and the plot have anything to do with that. So let's call this character ARN, who is male and is about 17 years old, let's say. And so that's pretty much sums up the entire character. And we need to also, at the very, very end, just quickly do dreams and quirks. So dreams. This character dreams of... this can become very, very obvious if you look back here. So this character would obviously dream of not being marginalized. This character would also dream of not being blind, as we've stated up here. And this character probably dreams for a steady relationship because they aren't currently in one. And if we look back here at the emotional reaction and the attention, well, obviously that is summed up there, because if you're not marginalized, you're not marginalized, and therefore this can have an emotional reaction on the readers if you play the story out correctly, including their handicaps and flaws. And they also want attention, and so this is also part of that point. Not being blind, well, that's obvious because it's a handicap, and you can fulfill this in some way. So, for example, maybe this character will have to choose between continuing to be blind or saving a family member, and if they choose blindness, that could put their family member in a worse situation, and then they could later come to regret that. And so that's just part of the story, and a steady relationship is back there. Yeah. And now if we move on to setting, obviously the first thing we've got to decide is whether it's set on Earth or whether it's set in a fictional location. This is second world because I prefer to write fantasy and science fiction, so it's second world. And then you've got to decide, then you've got to create the world. So create a map. I'm not going to go through this with you because it takes quite a while. So create a map. Let's call this map, this location, Thelisaren. Sounds like an elven place. And I would later draw an app. I would suggest you do so as well. And then you need to make sure locations make sense, as I've stated. And this can especially help if you're drawing things out or if you've got a map that someone else has drawn for you, or you're working with an artist, or you are the artist yourself. You have to ask yourself why things are there. So, for example, let's say that in the Thelisaren there are trees everywhere. Why are there trees everywhere? Well, this is obvious. It's because it's in a northern kind of climate. It's not too north. It's around the area of... It's off the southern eastern coast of Japan, let's say. And therefore, it's not going to be too cold that the trees can't survive, but it's not... It's a desert. And then let's say these characters sleep in hammocks or whatever, similar to James Cameron's Avatar. Oh, why do they sleep in hammocks? Because they're very in tune with the nature. Okay, that makes sense now. Now we need to borrow things from this world. And you could even include, imagine if you're doing a second world, you could include things such as humans, because the humans could be there. If we're writing something along the lines of Avatar, then characters, the humans are going to be invading whatever species lives there. Oh, we're not. So there are no humans, and you've got to decide on these things. Okay, if there are no humans, and yet it's off the southern east coast of Japan, why are there no humans there? Well, because it's surrounded by a magnetic sphere, for example. And I'm not going to rant on about this for too much longer, but one thing I want to touch on that I mentioned last session was that there's a cultural world. And the best way to do a cultural world is to base it cultural worlds that exist today. So you've got things like your cultural world, and you've got to look at things like the religion, or well, if you're looking at religion, then there's got to be some sort of like rules or concepts about how you came to be. And this can be inspired by the multitudes of religions that exist in today's world. And then after religion, you've got to look at the events, and these can be inspired by the religion. And so those are the main two I'd focus in the cultural world. And so this religion covers pretty much everything, including life, how life came to be, whether it's a creation story like Christianity, where it says that the God created everything, or whether it's something more along the lines of a science-based thing that kind of makes sense, like there was a massive energy build-up, and this energy came from nowhere. But you've got to, if you're going to do the sciencey thing, you've got to make sure that you either don't mention the energy build-up, because people will question that, and they'll say, how did that happen? or you come up with a scientific explanation that actually makes sense. And trust me, scientists have been trying for years, and it hasn't worked. So we're not gonna talk about setting, because this involves drawing stuff, or it involves just writing lots and lots down and eventually choosing on what you have. If I could, however, if you want, during the week, do that and put it in the chat if you wanted. Just tell me afterwards. And now we go on to plot. So in the previous session, I talked about the types of the main plot ideas that cover 99% of your stories. In this case, it will be a journey and return. And so this is where the character obviously goes somewhere, and then they come back having gained knowledge or gained some sort of magical spell or special ability. And the promises we're going to fulfill, I'm not going to write these down, but the promises will have to do with the character. So, for example, these are all promises here. You might not fulfill them all, but in this story, I'm going to fulfill this one. I'm going to fulfill this one. And I'm going to hint at fulfilling not being blind. Then if we look at whether it's a characters versus setting or characters versus characters, this is a characters versus characters. Because you've got the main character on one side, and you've got the people who are marginalizing on the other side. For example, it doesn't have to work that way. You could do characters versus setting, and some people have even done the characters versus themselves, or the characters versus the reader. And that can make it more interesting, but I'm just going to do characters versus characters here. And now if we think more about the actual storyline, you've got to start with a hook. So the hook in our case would be a character who wants something. So what does this character want? This character wants not to be marginalized. And if we include this hook, then the readers will be more likely to relate to it, especially those readers who have been marginalized. And so you need to think about working around the hook without overloading the hook with a whole bunch of information about the characters. This is why it's good to just get a basic idea of the characters before you do like a creation sheet where you answer a whole bunch of different questions about the character, like what's their favorite food? And so this is all we're going to leave plot on for now. But obviously you do a chapter by chapter or act by act look at things. And before we move on, we've got to choose which kind of framework we want to use. Most people, pretty much everyone, uses either the 3 acts or the hero's journey. And the hero's journey is becoming... It's not as broad as the 3 acts. It's far more specific. So, with the hero's journey, it only works for a small amount of stories, because there are things such as mentor dies, the mentor doesn't always die, or the hero gets an item, and this item has been replaced with knowledge more and more recently, and then the character is supposed to die whether this is physically or whether this is metaphorically. And then they return or born again. So I'm going to be using the 3 acts framework. I don't have to write this in though. I just wanted to talk about that quickly. But what I do have to talk about is making frameworks original. So if we look at the ways that I put last week into making it original, the characters are passionate about your own passions. We haven't covered passions, and I'm not going to, because this is very, very broad section, and you need to do it by yourself about what you wish the characters to be passionate about. But if I were to summarize passions, the passions are pretty much the dreams, because what they do will reflect that. If that makes sense. What they're passionate about will be focusing towards that. For example, if you'll probably be passionate about a certain person if you want to get into a steady relationship. You'll probably be passionate about getting attention if you don't want to be marginalized. So the way I'm going to make this framework original is I'm going to change the setting. So change in setting. And I'm also going to make the characters passionate about the main character passionate about these 3 pretty much. But I don't need to mention that. Now, if we just look at going more in depth into the plot, we do this here. The character succeeds in being in getting attention and kind of moving away from being marginalized. But as I mentioned previously, it comes as the price of the trust in family. But they lose trust in family. And then when they try to, the character then fails in retaining attention, but they gain the trust. They lose the trust but they gain the trust of their family. So these are kind of flip sides, the opposites of each other. I'm going to be using the first one, so that's going to be the plot, one of the plot points that's going to be in, because I'm using the 3-act framework, that's going to be in Act 1, where the crisis happens. And now we have to look at a language. Am I going to be creating a language for this character? Yes. I've already created a language, so we just put language here. This character will speak a language that reflects. And so you need to do this if you're creating a language, because you want to base it off existing languages in order to get people to relate. Sometimes it only works when you've got characters that seem like they're from this world and not from other worlds. So obviously this character is from Earth, so it has to make some sort of sense. With the language that they speak. So this language is going to be based off Japanese and Hindi, because it's in that kind of area of the ocean, and so one would think that the humans would have migrated there. And so it'll be a derivative of these two languages. And so if I were to use Vulgar, I'm not going to do this now because it will take way too long. If I were to do this, then I would input these two languages as examples with the phonetic sound. And the last thing to ask yourself is there a magic system? In this case, yes, there is a magic system. Okay, now what is it? Is it a hard system or is it a soft system? So as I discussed last week, hard system is with strict rules, such as those in Aragon, and a soft system is those that don't make sense, and they're very, very much based on awe. And so this is along the lines of Gandalf, and how it's really, really amazing how he can pull things off, but readers don't quite understand how he can pull things off. So this magic system, because a lot of the main characters will use this magic system, then it will have to be a hard system, because the readers will be able to understand it, and therefore it can't be it could be a soft system, but it's better if you stick to systems with rules if the character can understand them. If the readers can understand them. So what are these rules? If you're going into rules. One rule is the one where, say you mispronounce a spell, let's say, and you die. That's a very, very basic example, where if you say something incorrectly, either nothing happens, or so nothing would happen. That's Harry Potter. Or in the other direction, if you use up too much energy, you've also got to think about energy. That's where the hard system is a really crucial factor in the hard system, because you've got to think about how the energy works. In something like Harry Potter, the energy is limitless, but it can clash with energy from someone else. Whereas in a book like Aragon, as I mentioned previously, the energy is the same as it requires in physical life, and so when you cast a spell that does something that you can't physically do, then you die, or you get seriously injured, depending on how bad it is. And so what would we do from here? If this is going to be the only rule, then we've pretty much finished the very, very, very basic idea of world building. Well, the next thing we could do is we can create more characters. So if they want attention, if Aaron wants attention, and he's also been marginalized, then there's got to be someone who's preventing him from getting that attention. And so this creates the antagonist, or a group of antagonists. This could be a council, or a group of elders. So, for example, we'll use a group of elders, and let's say they're dragons, because who doesn't like using dragons? And then if we look into the relationship, okay, who does he want to have a steady relationship with? And that's another way we can create another character. Then you've also got to create their family, and so brothers, sisters, parents. You don't need to do the big whole family tree thing where you go off onto characters that aren't even mentioned. And friends. So let's say IRN has a few friends, and we'll create them individually. I will create this later this week, and if you want, I can show you how I did so. Right now, we're just talking about the basic idea of getting the main character, the main setting, and the very, very basic idea of a plot, language, and magic system. That concludes this session. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself now.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, I have some questions. I put them in the chat, actually.
Okay.
Because I wasn't sure if I was going to get that opportunity or not.
Yeah. Okay. Your
Pretty
first
likely.
question. Yeah. What your opinion is on themes?
Yes.
My common theme is how each of my characters deal with not being able to live up to the expectations of others. Well, I think you should have a combination of both. You should definitely be writing about things you think are interesting or cool, as you've put it. Because if you're passionate about your story, then most readers will be able to tell that, and they'll be passionate as well. And you should definitely have a theme, because if you don't have a theme, I wouldn't actually phrase it as theme. I would phrase it as your character's main. For example, your character's not being able to live up to the expectations of others. This is this could be considered motivation. So the motivation for these characters would be living up to expectations. So does this character want to live up to expectations?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well then that could be a motivation. And it could also be a flaw if they can't live up to the expectations of others. And so you can incorporate that in the flaws section here. And this can help develop your plot, as I'm sure it already has started doing. Does that answer your first question?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good answer. I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question.
And I especially like the part where you talked about, because this is what I had mine too, how each character deals with that motivation differently.
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah. Characters do need to deal with motivation differently and this can tie into how they would describe things. Because obviously their motivation will be different based on what they've been through in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So your next question, exposition.
Yes. Exposition, lore, backstory, those types of things.
Yeah. So you find it difficult to tackle why?
I just feel like if I start over-explaining things, it's kind of boring. It's going to bore the reader. I mean, in some cases it might not, but I think it will. Like, for example, if your story starts in a unique, like Harry doesn't start in a world where like, okay, this is wizards, this is magic. It just starts with Harry just living his life, and he learns about it as a student. But if your world doesn't feature your character being a student, I feel like it would be like harder to tackle.
Yeah, so you want to explain it to the audience. Think about your plot and think actually try explain it to someone when you don't have an exposition, and ask them if they have any questions about how anything works. So don't explain anything, just tell someone and ask them if they don't understand anything. Because
Mhm.
if they don't understand anything, then it becomes obvious to you that you need to include that in your story.
Mhm.
Yep. Does that help?
Yeah, I definitely think it does.
Yeah.
My only problem is, what if I'm like, okay, here's the thing, and I don't get this? Then I don't want to be like, okay, audience, here's how this thing works.
Yeah. It's a very tough question to answer, and it's because it really depends on what you're doing. Obviously, you've got to base it off other books. If you look at successful books, such as Harry Potter, as you've mentioned,
Yeah.
they do explain it, but they only explain it when it needs to be part of the story.
Mhm.
So, for you, if you're going to be explaining the lore or backstory, then the lore needs to be part of the story.
Mhm.
If you're doing backstory, I would not recommend, definitely would not recommend doing the backstory as like um, a chapter before the actual story starts, because
Yeah.
that can cram it all into one paragraph, and it's not very good unless you're writing a movie where it's very, very important that you do so, because then you have like the 15 years later kind of thing,
Oh,
and characters are like, wait a second, what happens in those 15 years? Sorry, readers are like, what happens in those 15 years? And I would suggest incorporating it. So, for example, imagine your character has these fears. Let's say they're dreaming, and you you write about so you have these dreams. The characters have these dreams, and in those dreams you discuss the characters' fears, their flaws, in a metaphorical kind of way.
mhm.
Another thing you can do, if you don't want to make it, if you want to make it obvious but you don't want to include it as a part of your story, is you can format the words differently. This is something that I've only seen in one book. Just wait a second, I'll be back in a second.
No problem.
Yeah, it's a book called Moonlight, I believe. It's written in, it's a story. It's a narrative. Um, and what the author has done is they've broken up the lines and have it look like a poem with
Hmm.
weird indentation, and this reflects the character's emotional state because his world is falling apart around him because his brother's about to be sentenced to death in Arizona.
Hmm.
And I think that if you had a character who was facing a similar kind of problem, you could do this because that's the only book that I've read that's done it, and therefore it's not very it's hasn't been explored, and it'd be interesting if lots more people did that. Um, does that answer your second question?
Yes, and thank you for the tip and the recommendation. I'll have to read.
Yeah. Your third question is about rising action. This is in the second act and the very, very end of the first act. Seems like when writing rising action, the things you could put in are practically infinite. How do you decide what events happen in this phase? Okay, so this is where you go back to the
First video.
characters' handicaps and flaws,
Uh,
and if you also the first act. So if you've got to think about the problem that happens in the first act. For example, the problem that happens in Aragon is the Razak are trying to kill him. It's very, very morbid. And so they try to escape. And this problem, is made worse when the character's mentor gets killed and when they get injured, if that makes sense. So the rising action has to do with what happens in the first act. You've got to link everything together. So that action will have to do with the character's motivation, the character's flaws, and the problem that happened in the first act. Because the problem needs to be made worse, and the problems, everything needs to be based around the character's motivation and flaws. Does that answer your final question?
Yeah, I believe so. Thank you for answering my questions. Sorry for taking up all the question time.
No, it's okay. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay. Well, that concludes the session today. I hope you learned something. I will convert this Notion thing to PDF, and then and later in the week I will elaborate more on this with multiple characters to show you what I mean. Okay. Bye.